Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to have my good friend, Dr. Gates. I first met Dr. Gates back in the June of 2001 at a private cruise in the Greek islands with former President George H.W. Bush. And when you're on a boat together for 5 days, you have no place else to go, so you tend to bond. So I really got to know him well. And of course, 3 months later, 9/11 happened, and the world hasn't been the same, including Greece, which at the time, the economy was still quite good. So before I get into some serious and tough questions, I'd just like to start with an easier one. So what are you doing now as a private citizen, and do you enjoy your life now as compared to before?
Well, I'm certainly enjoying my life a lot more than when I was in government. I published a book in January. I have another one coming out in about a year on how you lead reform or transformation of big organizations, big bureaucracies. I wanted to title it Taming the Beast, but unfortunately that title's already been taken in another context. So I'm finishing up writing that, and I'm in a small consulting business. I'm the chancellor of the College of William and Mary in Virginia, which is largely ceremonial, and last May became the national president of the Boy Scouts of America. So I'm finding ways to keep busy in my retirement.
And Starbucks, you're on the...
And I'm on the board of directors of Starbucks. I joined that board for a lot of reasons, but one was that I didn't have to get on an airplane to go to board meetings.
So this morning in the New York Times, there was a headline news about a clash over report about U.S. torture. So being a former CIA director, would you be willing to say a few words about?
Well, I think, first of all, that it was the prerogative of the Senate to publish the report. There are obviously a lot of CIA people who are mentioned in the book or in the report that believe that it was and some non-CIA people who were in the administration at that time who believe that it's not a balanced report, that a lot was left out, and that context is missing, and so on. But my attitude toward these things was shaped during the investigations of CIA in the mid-1970s, and that is that this is what makes the American intelligence services unique in the world in terms of not only the depth of congressional oversight of what they do, but public accountability. And there will be a lot of debate as a result of this report. But I think a lot of the information that is in the report, broadly speaking, has been out there for quite a while. Probably some of the graphic detail has not. But on the whole, I think getting these things out and letting them be a matter of public debate is better than trying to shield them and have everybody wonder what really was going on.
Dr. Gates, you served as Secretary of Defense under both President Bush and President Obama. And surprisingly, you're going to end up as the longest-serving Secretary of Defense for President Obama. So my question is twofold here. First, can you give us some insights on serving two presidents from two different parties with two different personalities? Secondly, President Obama will have his fourth Secretary of Defense, and this hasn't happened since President Truman. So what is the problem here?
Well, first of all, I think that people ask me how I could work for people as different as George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And my usual response is, well, you forget I worked for Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. So Bush and Obama were respectively the 7th and 8th presidents that I worked for, beginning with Lyndon Johnson in 1966. I was very junior then, obviously. But you basically, as a civil servant, you adapt to the styles of each president, and each of the 8 presidents I served had a very different style. I like to joke that with President George W. Bush, because I wasn't into mountain biking, I missed my bonding opportunity with him, and I was a foot too short and 20 years too old to play basketball with Obama. So my relationship with both was very friendly and relaxed and casual, but entirely professional. I think that the 2 biggest differences that I saw, was that President Obama was much more analytical, as one might expect of a law professor, and when he had the time, wanted to delve into the deepest details of issues. As he would put it more than once, I can't defend it if I don't understand it. President Bush was more of an instinctive decision maker. He relied more on his gut and on his instincts. But the one thing that is known about President Bush, I think, comes as a surprise to people about President Obama, and that is that for somebody who'd never really run anything, Obama was very comfortable making decisions and making tough decisions, life and death decisions. He relished it. He never shrank from it. And while he liked to take as much time as he could before making a decision, when pressed and when he had to make a quick decision of importance, he was willing to do that.
What is your view on the U.S. role and the key
Well,
security?
I didn't answer the second part of
okay.
your question
Okay.
about four defense secretaries.
Yeah, okay.
I will say this: President repeatedly asked me to stay through the end of the first term, and even beyond, and continued to do that right up until a few days before he announced that I was leaving. We had a lot of disagreements, and we spoke very frankly with one another, particularly in private. And we would have a real debate about something, a real argument. And at the end, he would stand up in the Oval Office and smile and say, "Are you sure I can't get you to stay another year?" But I had already served 2 years under President Bush, so I had been secretary for 4.5 years, longer than all but 4 of my predecessors, 2 of which had to resign in disgrace, one of whom was indicted, and I just didn't see much merit in staying on a lot longer. And frankly, I was exhausted. Leon Panetta was, I think, always the idea was that Leon would serve to the end of the first term. So Leon's decision to retire was not a surprise. I think that the one surprise has been the short tenure of Secretary Hagel.
So what is your view on the U.S. role on the key security issues in East Asia, such as Japan-Korea relationship, China-Japan relations, and North Korea and the reunification of the peninsula?
Well, I think that first of all, I think that the pivot to Asia was, as much as anything, a rebalancing, having been focused on the Middle East since 2001. And one of my regrets, this basically took place with the beginning of the second term, and my one regret is that the pivot, the so-called pivot, has had more military definition than it has political and economic. And I think the administration would have been better served to put less emphasis on the military changes, which, for all practical purposes, have been in the works for quite a while. I was talking about troops rotating in and out of northern Australia when I was secretary, also about having ships in Singapore and so on, while I was still secretary. So military changes, for all they've been touted, have either been in the works for quite some time or are relatively modest. I wish there'd been more political and economic emphasis. But I think the message that the U.S. intends to remain engaged in Asia is certainly an important one after the preoccupation in the Middle East and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a message both to our friends and to others like China that the United States intends to remain engaged here and be a constructive participant in the development of these relationships. I think that the U.S. particularly has a role to play in helping improve relations between Japan and Korea. When I was secretary at the Shangri-La Conference, I held the first trilateral meetings of the U.S., Japanese, and South Korean defense ministers, and we did that 2 years in a row. And so there's a lot of history, obviously, and I think the U.S. can help focus both countries on the future rather than on the past. And I'm glad to see, as stiff as it appeared in public, at least the meeting of President Xi and Prime Minister Abe, I think, is an important step forward. There's obviously huge and growing economic connections among these countries, although Japanese investment in China has dropped off. But I think in all of these areas, the United States can play a constructive role, and in some places a go-between, and in other cases, as I did with the defense ministers, a convener to get people talking about some of these issues.
What is your opinion on Kim Jong-un?
I worry because of his youth and inexperience. I recall, as many of you do, the extraordinary bellicose talk a year ago last spring. I have no evidence, but I strongly suspect that the Chinese weighed in to quiet that down, which clearly was coming from him. I think when I was secretary, we had a lot of information indicating that he, as part of the succession and establishing himself and his bona fides with the North Korean military, that he had played a personal role in the decision-making with respect to the sinking of the Chonun and also the shelling of the islands. So I think he's a worry. I think he's as big a worry to the Chinese as he is to the rest of us.
Well, talking about China, do you think China has a grand strategy for the next decades? And do you believe that they have a clear vision of its role in the international system and is willing to contribute positively to the world order?
Well, I think with respect to the final question, that remains to be seen. People talk a lot about the emergence of China, when I think it's more accurate and provides greater historical context to talk about the reemergence of China. After all, this was one of the greatest powers in the world for more than a couple of millennia. China was a great power when those of us with European backgrounds were still painting ourselves blue and dancing around campfires. And so I think this history shapes China's view of its role not only in the Pacific but in the world as a whole. And they have their own self-interest is in becoming a responsible stakeholder. They need the freedom of navigation as much as any of the rest of us. They need protection of the global commons as much as any of the rest of us. Their economy is deeply tied to other countries, the United States, South Korea, Japan, Europe, and so on. So the question is whether as I say, they were a great empire for a couple of millennia, then they had a couple of bad centuries. But they're coming back from that, and I think they expect to be treated as a world power. They expect respect. And the question is how much deference they expect. Now, when it comes to the military, I believe that the Chinese are a lot smarter than the Soviets. I don't think the Chinese have any intention of trying to match the United States in terms of global military power, ship for ship, plane for plane, and so on. I think that, first of all, they are focusing their development efforts in areas where we are vulnerable, not where we're strong. So they're putting a lot of focus on anti-satellite capabilities, cyber, and on highly accurate anti-ship cruise and ballistic missiles that can hold our carriers at risk. I think they do intend to challenge us, our predominance militarily in the Pacific region. And a recent report that came out indicated that by 2020, the United States will have 67 submarines and surface ships, warships, in the Pacific area, budget permitting, and a key caveat. The Chinese will have 350. So even if you grant that ours may be technologically more advanced for the most part, at a certain point, numbers actually do begin to matter. And so the question is how we manage this relationship. And I think there is no inherent geostrategic reason for us to be adversaries. And so the key going forward is how effectively the leadership of both countries can manage this relationship, as well as the leadership in South Korea and the leadership in Japan, for that matter. I don't think that there's any preordained outcome to any of this, but it is going to take some skill, and we do have to recognize China's interests and its own expectations and its own view of itself. That doesn't mean we have to defer to that, but we at least better keep it in mind as we formulate our own policies.
Well, Dr. Gates, you're an expert on Soviet Union, now Russia. So any insights on Russia and the world according to Vladimir Putin?
I think the key to Putin is understanding that he is a man of the past. He's all about lost power, lost glory, lost empire. He has said, as most of you know, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geostrategic catastrophe of the 20th century. And I don't think that, as some have said, he's delusional or that he is mindlessly aggressive, but I do think that his policies are shaped by two objectives. The first is, and I think he now considers this a personal mission, is the protection of the 25 million Russians who were left behind with the collapse of the Soviet Union and who are now living in independent states. So above all, Eastern Ukraine, but also Latvia, Estonia, Transnistria, Moldova, even perhaps Kazakhstan, but protecting them in the sense of their right to their language, teaching of Russian history, and right to practice their Russian Orthodox faith, and so on. I think this also provides an excuse, if you will, or a pretext for when he chooses to meddle in the internal affairs of any of these countries. The second general theme, I think, of Putin's policies is as old as the Russian Empire itself, and that is the recreation of a buffer of states on the periphery of Russia that look to Moscow economically, politically, and for security. Ukraine is central to that. Sometimes people forget that the Russian Empire actually had its roots in Kiev, in Russia, in Ukraine, 1,000 years ago. So I think Ukraine has a special place in that constellation and helps explain the actions that he's taken in eastern Ukraine. But I think that I think you will see continued pressure in other states on the periphery of Russia as he tries to do the same. And some of these states create their own problem. For example, in Estonia, about a quarter of the population is Russian. But if they don't speak Estonian, they can't be Russian citizens. So for all practical purposes, by Estonian law, they have created their own group of discontented people, 25% of their population, who cannot become Estonian citizens since they don't speak Estonian. I think this is a source of weakness for Estonia, and frankly, I think they ought to fix it, and fix it fast. But I think Putin is rational. I think that he will. I think the only thing he understands is countervailing pressure. I also think that it's pretty clear that the economic sanctions that have been applied have not had a deterrent effect on him and have not changed his mind. The truth is the price of oil probably has had a much more significant impact on Russia than the sanctions at this point.
Well, I would like to open the floor for questions. And now, since we spoke about this part of the world, maybe I would like to ask His Royal Highness Prince Turki to maybe ask a question about Middle East. So, 마이크 좀 갖다 주시죠. Yeah.
Mr. Secretary, you said you served under 8 presidents. And during that time, of course, the Middle East figured importantly, I think, in American policy and American action. Can you give us your view on where we can go from here now that Mr. Kerry's efforts seem to have at least been suspended for some time, and the present president has only 2 more years to go, maybe even less than that. So where do we go from here? Any ideas?
Well, I think it's important to look at the region more broadly, because I think it is a source of likely to be a source of instability, turbulence, and conflict for quite a long time to come. Because, as I see it, there are 4 struggles or conflicts going on simultaneously in the region. The first is the struggle between Shia Islam, led by Iran, and Sunni Islam. The second is reformers versus authoritarians. The third is secularists versus Islamists. And the fourth, and the one we're seeing most vividly right now, is whether artificially created states such as Syria, Iraq, and Libya, comprised of historically adversarial tribes, ethnic groups, and religious groups, can hold together absent significant repression, or whether they go the way of Yugoslavia. And right now, based on what we are seeing in Libya and in Syria, I would say the prospects are not terribly promising. And until the change of government in Iraq, I would have included Iraq in that. Now it's a little more iffy. So I think you've got all these things going on simultaneously. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a piece of that, but only a piece, and I think does not capture the non-Israel conflicts that are going on in the region that may have significant consequence, well, that I believe will have significant consequences for the future. I think that any prospect, any progress on the 2-state solution on Israel and the Palestinians first has to figure out a way past the divisions on the Palestinian side, first of all, and whether Jerusalem is is negotiating with the West Bank Palestinians, or is it negotiating with Hamas? The latter having sworn its destruction. And frankly, until that gets sorted out, I think the prospects for success are pretty limited. I would add to that, and we'll see what happens in the new Israeli election that's coming up, but there's a lot of talk about a more rightward drift in Israeli politics. And if that happens, then I already think that the Israeli government under Bibi Netanyahu is pretty right-wing. So the question is, if that moves even further right, I think it diminishes even further any prospect for success. So I think that the one other lesson that we should take, beginning with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and then the successful effort to oust Gaddafi, is that we in the West, and we in the United States in particular, I think vastly overestimate our ability to shape events in that part of the world. And we were as unprepared for a post-Gaddafi period as we were for a post-Saddam period. And so, frankly, I am more cautious about particularly U.S. military engagement in the region, beginning with my opposition to the intervention in Libya, than I think a lot of people are.
Next question? Yes.
Mr. Gates, do you think in retrospect that the U.S. has backed the wrong party or inadvertently created monsters like the Taliban in Afghanistan or the ISIS? I can only think of one parallel in India, and that is the government was soft or created the specter of the Sikh leader Bhindranwale and ultimately had to go to eliminate him.
I think that policymakers everywhere, not just in the United States, don't probably pay enough attention to unintended consequences in terms of, if we do this, then what? And where could it go wrong? I think that I was very involved as CIA deputy director and acting director during the latter half of the 1980s in supporting the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan. I think what a lot of people don't realize about that period was how little influence the U.S. had in terms of what was going on inside Afghanistan with the Mujahideen. For all practical purposes, the United States was the quartermaster, and Pakistan played the primary role in determining who would get the weapons that we were sending to fight the Soviets. And their mantra to us always was, we're giving them to the groups that are fighting the hardest. But I ended up in Peshawar in October of 1986 because we couldn't get the Pakistanis to give Massoud and the Tajiks any stingers. And so the whole purpose of my visit was to put the squeeze on the Pakistanis to at least give the Tajiks and the Panjshir Valley some equipment. So I think we did not have a very good appreciation either from a policy standpoint or from an intelligence standpoint of some of the internal dynamics among the Mujahideen at that time. And I think it's only, we knew that a lot of weapons were going to the likes of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and others. But in terms of which groups were more fundamentalist than others and the notion of them evolving into what became the Taliban, frankly, there were virtually no discussions of any of that I can recall in U.S. government councils. It was really all about how do we inflict a defeat on the Soviet Union here and force them to get out of Afghanistan.
Mr. Secretary, I'm from Israel, and I'd like to know what you think about the talks with Iran. Do you think really it will bring us to a situation in which Iran will give up on their desire to purchase or to have a nuclear weapon? And what do you think, how serious is the promise of President Obama that say he will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon?
My first encounter with the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran was in October of 1979 when I accompanied National Security Advisor Zbig Brzezinski to Algiers for the 25th anniversary of the Algerian Revolution. And the leadership of the Iranian government asked to see Brzezinski. And he got permission, and I went along as the note taker, and we met with the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, and the Foreign Minister. And this was 8 months after the revolution, 7 or 8 months. And Brzezinski said, we'll recognize your revolution. We'll sell you everything we had contracted to sell to the Shah. We will work with you because we have a common enemy to your north, the Soviet Union. The Iranians said, give us the Shah, who was then being treated medically in the United States. And the two sides went back and forth like that for an hour. Finally, Brzezinski stood up and said, for us to give you the Shah would be incompatible with our national honor. The meeting ended. 3 days later, our embassy was seized, and 2 weeks later, all of those officials were out of a job, and a couple of them were in jail. As I like to put it, that began my now more than 30-year quest for the elusive Iranian moderate. I believe, first of all, that the Iranian decision to come to the negotiating table should be seen as a success for the policies pursued by the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations in dramatically ratcheting up the economic pressures and diplomatic isolation on Iran and the cost to the Iranian economy. We had no choice but to go to those negotiations, in my view. I would tell you that the question of the Iranian nuclear program is maybe the toughest that I've encountered since I first entered public service almost 50 years ago, because there is only one good outcome, and it also happens to be, in my view, the least likely, which is that Iran says, okay, we won't do this. We won't build nuclear weapons, and we will allow an inspection regime to prove that that's the case. So I think that, and I agree with Netanyahu, I don't agree with Bibi on a lot of things, but I agree with him that no agreement is better than a bad agreement. The question is whether we have moved to a place, I think there's a Western question and an Iranian question. P5+1, have we moved to a place, contrary to the UN Security Council resolution, which says no enrichment capability for Iran, to where we're willing to allow a limited enrichment capability, but limited enough that it gives us at least a year of advance notice if they should choose to make a dash for a weapon through violating things and beginning to enrich and so on, and moving all that they already have enriched beyond a certain level out of the country. Have we moved to a position where we're willing to accept that? It sounds to me like we probably have. The question that the Iranians have is, are they willing to do it? Are they willing to go from 19,000 centrifuges to 4,000 or 5,000? The Ayatollah has been pretty clear the answer is no. And if that is the answer, then it's hard for me to see how we get to an agreement. So I think kicking the can down the road was better than saying that the negotiations have failed. But I think that the Iranians themselves have not come to a conclusion as to what they are willing to accept. My own view, is that they intend to become a threshold nuclear state with the ability to move to a weapon in a relatively short period of time, a year or thereabouts. And the question is whether the U.S., whether the P5+1 and Israel can accept that outcome and live with it as the alternative to a military attack, which would only delay this program, depending on who you talk to, 2 to 4 years, no matter who hits them, whether it was us or Israel or anybody else. So I think that's why it's such a tough problem. And the biggest decisions, I think, still need to be made, and they're on the Iranian side.
So I'll go with you, and then after you.
Mr. Secretary, to stay on the Middle East, if you had been at the Defense Department in 2011, 2012, 2013, what would you have advised the American president to do on Syria, and in particular at the time of the Red Line moment?
Well, first of all, I would have very strongly advised against drawing a red line. My advice to presidents when it comes to red lines and ultimata is don't cock that pistol unless you're willing to fire it. And I think that failing to act when the red line was crossed imposed a great cost on American credibility around the world. That said, let me take you back. I opposed the military intervention in Libya. My argument in the Situation Room was twofold. First of all, can I just finish the 2 wars I'm already in before you guys go looking for a third one? But the other was, we have no idea what comes after Gaddafi. Right now, he's quiescent. He's given up his nuclear program. He's not a threat. And you know, was there going to be a humanitarian catastrophe in Benghazi? Perhaps. And should we have acted to prevent it? Probably. But we went a long way from preventing a humanitarian catastrophe in Benghazi to the all-out bombing of Tripoli and other targets in Libya that was required to get Gaddafi out of power. So my concern, and I go back to what I said about unintended consequences. So in the space of less than a decade, we overthrew 2 leaders, 2 really bad guys, Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, and look what we ended up with in both cases afterward. And what is our intent? What would have been our intent? What was our post-Assad plan for Syria? We didn't have any more idea who would take power in Syria than we did in Libya. So I probably would have supported a much faster and much more ambitious covert program with our allies in the region to bolster what was still then, in the first months of the Civil War, a relatively moderate opposition. But I think that window was open only for about 6 to 10 months. And after that, then I think we have no clue what's going to come next. And to pretend that we do is to ignore the experience of the last 11, 12 years.
Hi, let me leave the Middle East for a while. As we have known, Carter is being nominated by the President to be the next Defense Secretary. And what do you think, I mean, I would have to, what do you think, how would Carter pursue the Obama Defense agenda. Also, let me quote an article that I've read about, according to Carter's career, it leaves quite a trail of a hard-nosed view of policy puzzles like North Korea and Russia. So what do you think if Carter becomes actually the defense secretary? Do you think it will have changes between the approach of the U.S. when it comes to North Korea and how it would actually affect the relationship between the Korean Peninsula and the U.S. itself?
First thing to remember is that whoever is the Secretary of Defense, the President still makes the decisions. And it doesn't matter whether he has a very close relationship with his Secretary of Defense or a distant one. I personally think that of the people who are possible secretaries of defense and who haven't taken themselves out of the running, I happen to think Ash Carter is a terrific choice by the president. Ash ran acquisition, technology, and logistics for me and worked for me for 2.5 years. He knows how to manage the Pentagon. He's got a good relationship with the uniformed military. He's committed to taking good care of the troops. He is, I think, a hard-nosed realist. And I think there will be some areas in which he has differences with other members of the national security team, including the president. And I have no doubt that Ash will make those views known candidly in the Situation Room and in his meetings with the president. And I also have no doubt that once the president makes a decision, that Ash will salute and do what the president has decided. Frankly, at this point in a presidential administration, the likelihood of any kind of a sharp departure in dealing with either North Korea or Russia, I believe, is pretty unlikely. So what you may see are changes in nuance and tone, but I don't think you'll see any kind of a significant change in direction.
Former Prime Minister Lee.
Your sense is that the leadership in Iran is determined to become a nuclear power. The same situation in the North Korea. The difference is that in the Asia Pacific, as you have mentioned, we have now two great powers, the United States and China. And I think no great power would like to see a smaller neighbor acquiring nuclear capability. So my question is, would the United States really try to work with China to resolve this problem? If these two great powers couldn't handle this issue, I don't think there's anything world could expect from anywhere. Would you have some comment on this?
I think that, first of all, I think the United States would like nothing better than to work with China toward the elimination of nuclear weapons in North Korea. There are many people in this audience, I'm confident, who are far stronger experts on both China and North Korea than I am. But my impression for many years has been that while, in fact, in some ways contrary to our preferences, that while China has influence in Pyongyang, it does not have control. And I think there have been some occasions when the North Korean leadership has taken actions that have surprised the Chinese and angered the Chinese and have elicited a response from the Chinese toward the North in terms of their anger. So I think this is something we both have in common. I will say this as an aside in terms of Iran. Iran and its in its desire to become a nuclear threshold state and potentially a nuclear weapons state. Iran sees how easily the United States ousted Saddam Hussein, who had no nuclear weapons. They see how easily Gaddafi and his ragtag army were ousted by the militias and Western air power. But they also see how cautiously everybody tiptoes around North Korea because they have a handful of very crude nuclear weapons. I think the Iranians are very observant about what that all means in terms of their own desires and intentions. But I think that we had evidence at times during the famine of the Chinese sending significant food aid to North Korea and using railroad gondolas. And the North Koreans would turn around and steal the Chinese gondolas. So, in some ways I wish that the Chinese had control in North Korea, in Pyongyang, but they don't. And I believe this is an area of common interest between the United States and China to try and reduce the threat that is posed by North Korea having these weapons. This is a subject that I posed repeatedly with my Chinese counterparts when I was Defense Secretary. And I would tell you, frankly, that it was clear, at least in the military channel, that was a conversation they were not yet prepared to have.
We'll have last week questions. Generally, you've been raising your hand a long time, and then and then the lady in the green sweater there, and we'll finish it off.
Thank you very much, Tatsu Master from Japan. I have one easy question, tough one. How do you keep yourself so well fit after years of tough decisions as Defense Secretary? More seriously, I'm very grateful your people, military personnel, helped Japan after East Asian earthquake. 19,000 personnel helped us out. Thank you for that. But one big issue lingering in my mind is the military nuclear umbrella covering East Asia. The reality is that nuclear umbrella is one of the most powerful means to keep the peace in that part of the world, like it or not. But it's a very crude defense system. How long nuclear weapon system could prevail as one of the lethal and last resort? Would it disappear in your lifetime, in the lifetime of young people here, or that will stay in place in coming several decades? Thank you.
Well, I think we all know what we hope the answer would be, that the need for nuclear weapons would disappear. I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime. It is, as we see other countries continuing to develop their nuclear capabilities and delivery systems. I think that one of my big concerns, for example, should Iran continue on the path that they're on, is that it will lead to a proliferation problem in the Middle East itself, as other countries decide they have to at least have capabilities commensurate with Iran's. So I think in the foreseeable future, there's not much prospect of that, but I think we always have to keep it in the forefront of the agenda, and particularly in terms of doing everything we can do to prevent further proliferation. And again, I keep coming back to Iran, but I think that would be for Iran to acquire a nuclear capability would dramatically increase the danger of a whole new level of proliferation and in the most volatile part of the world.
Mr. Secretary, what would you say to those
who say that the American sun is setting, it is in decline, and somebody else will replace it.
Well, I would say that that's been said before. And there are a number of empires, most recently the Soviet Empire, who felt that and are now in the ash can of history. So I think in a way, I worry a lot about our internal political paralysis at home. But I think if you look at, for example, the resurgence of the American economy compared to almost anybody else's in the world, it's a pretty extraordinary thing. So my view is that, the United States, you could argue that American preeminence and predominance has been declining ever since 1950. But that's as much as anything a manifestation of the success of American policies in the reconstruction of Japan and the reconstruction of Europe and the development of extraordinarily dynamic economies in these countries, which have had the effect of reducing the U.S. domination of the global economy and global trade statistically. But it certainly hasn't had an impact, a negative impact on American economic strength at home. So I think that this sequestration of the budget has potentially very serious long-term consequences for our military. There may be a more stupid way to cut the American government budget, but I can't think of one. And my hope is that the Congress and the President can work together to get rid of it before next fall. But other than our domestic political issues, which I think are serious, there is no doubt in my mind that the United States will continue to accept its global responsibilities and continue its global leadership role. When you think of the variety of problems around the world, the question is who has the capacity to convene people? Who has the will and the power to get diverse peoples to come together to try and address problems? Who is it that's almost always in the lead when there's a humanitarian catastrophe? So I think that it's in everybody's interest for China to become economically stronger, for Europe to recover, for Japan to be stronger. That will diminish our percentage of the global GDP, if you will. But the health of the world will be significantly improved by that. But I think I am, in this respect, a real optimist. I think that, as Mark Twain would have said, that the rumors of his demise were greatly exaggerated.
Okay, last question.
To follow up from this, Mr. Secretary, could you tell us how the U.S. positions itself with regard to the umbrella movement in Hong Kong? Thank you very much.
Well, I think that the U.S. has been supportive of the democracy movement in Hong Kong. I think that in no small part this is about governments keeping the commitments that were made at an earlier time, and at the same time it's the balancing act that we have had to go throughout our entire history as a country, of balancing our interests and our ideals. And there is no doubt about where America stands in terms of democracy and freedom. But at the same time, we also obviously have an interest in pursuing a constructive relationship with China. So I think we have to continue to articulate that in terms of our values, we're very much on the side of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong and of fulfilling the terms of the agreement as originally signed in terms of elections and so on. But people who want us to go all the way have to remember that we also have significant interests with China and others here in the region.
Well, I just want to conclude by that Dr. Gates lives about 60, 70 miles from Seattle, up in the mountains. So besides Alaska and Hawaii, it's about as far as you can get from Washington, D.C. So I don't know if that was done deliberately, but...
It absolutely was.
And also, Dr. Gates hasn't traveled much after he's left office. This is like his only fourth trip abroad, and 2 of them was to Korea. So I really like to thank you for coming and for your wisdom. And let's give him a very big hand for...
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.